It all started with a letter, a simple, worn-out envelope addressed to me in shaky handwriting. The sender was an old acquaintance, a retired sailor named Arthur, who had spent most of his life navigating the treacherous waters off the East Coast. Inside was a short note and a key. Elliot, if you're reading this, it means I've gone where no compass can follow. There's something I need you to see. The lighthouse by Blackthorn Cove? You know the one. Go there, and you'll understand why I couldn't let it rest. Take care, my friend, Arthur. I hadn't spoken to Arthur in years, but I remembered his stories. Wild, often unbelievable tales about cursed ships, ghostly figures in the fog, and most notably, the Blackthorn Lighthouse. He used to say it was a place where the living didn't belong, a beacon that guided not only ships, but also things best left unseen. I always thought he was exaggerating. Curiosity got the better of me. A few days later, I packed my bag, tossed the key into my jacket pocket, and drove toward the coast. As the roads grew narrower and the landscape more desolate, a strange sense of unease settled over me. By the time I reached the small fishing village near Blackthorn Cove, the sun was already dipping below the horizon, casting long shadows across the jagged cliffs. The villagers weren't exactly welcoming. When I mentioned the lighthouse, conversation stopped, and wary eyes followed me wherever I went. One old fisherman, sitting by the docks, muttered something under his breath as I passed by. I caught the words, "the cursed light," before he turned away, crossing himself as if to ward off some unseen evil. Blackthorn Lighthouse stood alone at the edge of the cove, perched on a rocky outcrop battered by relentless waves. It was an imposing structure, its black and white facade weathered by decades of salty winds. The light at its peak hadn't shone in years, but the tower seemed alive in its own eerie way, almost as if it was watching me approach. Using Arthur's key, I unlocked the heavy iron gate at the base of the tower. The hinges groaned like a dying animal as I pushed it open, the sound echoing in the stillness. The air inside was damp and carried a faint metallic tang, like rust or blood. I climbed the winding staircase, each step amplifying the sense of being utterly alone. The higher I went, the stronger the feeling of being watched grew. Shadows flickered in the corners of my vision, but whenever I turned to look, there was nothing there. At the top of the lighthouse, I found Arthur's journal. It was lying on an old wooden table next to a lantern that still had a bit of oil left. The first few pages were filled with hastily scribbled notes about strange lights over the sea, voices carried on the wind, and cold spots that seemed to move of their own accord. But it was the last entry that sent a chill down my spine. The light doesn't just warn ships, it calls to them, to the lost, the damned, and the things beneath the waves. I've seen them, I've heard them, and now they've seen me. That was when I heard it. A low, mournful sound, like the howl of the wind, but layered with something else. A voice, faint, almost melodic, calling my name. Elliot? I froze, gripping the journal tightly. The sound wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from below, somewhere deep within the lighthouse. And then, just for a moment, the long extinguished light above flickered to life. The flickering light above sent a cold shiver down my spine, illuminating the room for just a moment before plunging me back into the oppressive darkness. My breathing quickened as I tried to convince myself it was just the wind. some old mechanism in the lighthouse reacting to years of neglect. But deep down, I knew better. The voice I heard, the one calling my name, lingered in the silence like an echo that refused to fade. I clutched Arthur's journal tighter, my hands trembling as I scanned the room for anything else he might have left behind. The pages of the journal whispered as I flipped through them, looking for some explanation, some clue about what he had uncovered. One entry stood out. The voices are clearest at night, but they don't always call your name. Sometimes they cry. Other times they laugh. And sometimes they sound like people you've lost. Don't listen to them. I couldn't help but glance over my shoulder. The silence in the room felt too heavy, too unnatural. It was as if the very air had stopped moving, waiting for something. I decided to descend the staircase, back toward the entrance. But as I took my first step, the sound of heavy footsteps echoed from below. "Hello," I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. The footsteps stopped abruptly. The pause was worse than the sound itself, a suffocating anticipation that made my skin crawl. I gripped the railing, peering down the spiraling staircase. But there was nothing there, just the gaping darkness that seemed to stretch endlessly. Then the footsteps started again. But this time they were louder, faster, coming up toward me. My heart pounded in my chest as I stumbled backward into the lantern room. I grabbed the lantern on the table, fumbling to light it with the matchbox I found nearby. The flame sputtered to life, casting a dim, flickering glow around me. "Who's there?" I demanded, my voice breaking. The footsteps stopped just outside the door to the lantern room. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then the door creaked open, ever so slightly, and a chilling draft swept into the room. I held the lantern high, the flame trembling as much as my hands. Standing in the doorway was a figure, a shadowy silhouette that didn't belong to any living being. It was tall, its form distorted as if it were made of smoke, constantly shifting and writhing. Two pinpricks of pale, glowing light stared at me where its eyes should have been. I wanted to scream, to run, but my legs felt rooted to the floor. The figure didn't move, but the air around it grew colder, the kind of cold that sinks into your bones. And then it spoke. "Why have you come here?" The voice was low and guttural, layered with what sounded like multiple voices speaking in unison. I couldn't find the words to respond. My throat felt dry, my chest tight. The figure stepped closer, and I instinctively backed away, my back pressing against the cold, damp wall. I'm here because of Arthur," I managed to choke out. "He sent me." At the mention of Arthur's name, the figure paused. The glowing lights where its eyes had been dimmed, and for a moment I thought it might vanish. But instead, it laughed, a sound that was neither human nor entirely of this world. "Arthur sought answers," it said, its voice dripping with malice. "He found more than he bargained for. And now, so will you." Before I could react, the lantern's flame extinguished, plunging me into total darkness. The cold intensified, and I felt something brush against my arm, something wet and slimy, like the tendrils of a sea creature. I stumbled forward, desperate to escape whatever was in the room with me. As I scrambled back toward the staircase, the lighthouse seemed to come alive. The walls groaned, the floorboards beneath me creaked and buckled, and the air was filled with the sound of whispers. Hundreds of them, overlapping and indistinct. They were coming from every direction, wrapping around me like a suffocating fog. When I reached the staircase, I froze. The steps, once solid, now appeared warped and uneven, as if they were sinking into the very rock of the lighthouse. A dark, viscous liquid seeped through the cracks, pooling at the base. It smelled of salt and decay, a nauseating stench that made my stomach churn. I hesitated, unsure if I could even trust the stairs to hold my weight. But then I heard it again, that voice, this time louder and more insistent. Elliot has come to us. It wasn't coming from above or below. It was coming from inside the walls, resonating through the lighthouse itself. I turned back toward the lantern room, but the door had vanished. In its place was a solid wall, as if it had never existed. Panic surged through me. I descended the staircase as quickly as I could, ignoring the way the steps groaned under my weight. The whispers grew louder, turning into a cacophony of screams and laughter. Shadows danced along the walls, shapes that defied logic and reason. When I finally reached the base of the lighthouse, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The iron gate I had unlocked earlier was now wide open, but beyond it was no longer the rocky shore. Instead, it was a swirling void of black water, stretching infinitely in every direction. And standing at the edge of the gate was Arthur, or at least something that looked like him. His face was pale, almost translucent, and his eyes were hollow sockets. He smiled at me, a grotesque, unnatural grin that stretched far too wide. "I told you not to come," he said, his voice distorted and echoing. "Now, you'll never leave." Behind him, the water began to churn violently, and from its depths emerged countless hands, pale, skeletal hands, reaching upward, clawing at the air. They grasped at Arthur, pulling him backward into the void. He didn't resist. He just stared at me, his smile never faltering, as he was swallowed by the darkness. The gate slammed shut with a deafening clang, and I was left alone in the silence. Or so I thought. A soft, wet sound came from behind me, like something dragging itself across the floor. I turned slowly, the lantern shaking in my hand as I raised it, and there, in the center of the room, was the figure from before. Only this time, it wasn't alone. It was surrounded by others, dozens of them, their glowing eyes piercing through the darkness. The last thing I heard before the lantern's flame went out again was the sound of their laughter. I don't remember how long I stood there, paralyzed in the suffocating darkness of the lighthouse, surrounded by the shadowy figures. Their laughter echoed through the cavernous space, a sound so unnerving it seemed to burrow into my mind, refusing to let go. My chest heaved as I fought against the crushing weight of panic. My thoughts, a chaotic mess of escape plans and despair. The lantern in my hand was dead, its glass cold and unresponsive. But I clung to it, like it was the last tether to my sanity. "Think, Elliot, think," I whispered to myself. My voice sounded small, fragile, like a candle flame in a storm. I took a step back, and the figures moved with me, closing the gap. Their glowing eyes were the only visible feature in the dense shadows, each pair fixed on me like a predator to its prey. My back hit the icy stone wall, and I realized I had nowhere left to run. In a moment of desperation, I reached into my pocket and pulled out Arthur's journal. If there was ever a time for it to hold answers, this was it. My fingers fumbled with the pages, but the figures weren't waiting for me to figure it out. They began to advance, their forms shifting and writhing like smoke, tendrils of darkness stretching toward me. "Stay back," I shouted, my voice cracking. It was a futile command, and I knew it. As I flipped through the journal, my eyes caught a passage I hadn't noticed before. The words seemed to glow faintly on the page, as if they were calling out to me. The light is their prison. Keep it burning, and they cannot escape. The lantern. My heart leapt with a flicker of hope as I realized what I had to do. I dropped the journal and grabbed the matchbox from my pocket, my hands shaking so badly that it took 3 tries to strike a match. The figures were nearly upon me, their cold, formless tendrils brushing against my skin, sending waves of icy dread through my body. Finally, the match caught, and I touched it to the lantern's wick. The flame roared to life, brighter than it had any right to be, flooding the room with blinding light. The shadows recoiled instantly, their forms hissing and writhing as they retreated to the edges of the room, unable to withstand the lantern's glow. But I wasn't safe yet. The light might have pushed them back, but it didn't banish them. Their eyes still glowed in the darkness, filled with malice and hunger. I knew I had to find a way to end this for good. Arthur's journal lay open on the floor, and I bent to pick it up, keeping the lantern held high. The next line of the passage offered a grim solution. The light must reach the heart of the darkness. Only then will the curse be broken. The heart of the darkness. I glanced toward the spiral staircase. It was the only place left to go. Back up to the lantern room at the top of the lighthouse. The thought of climbing those stairs again, with the shadows watching my every move, made my stomach churn, but I didn't have a choice. I moved cautiously toward the stairs, the lantern casting a protective bubble of light around me. The shadows hissed and recoiled as I passed, but they didn't follow. For now, the light was enough to keep them at bay. The climb was grueling. Every creak of the stairs, every gust of wind rattling the old structure, felt like a warning. When I finally reached the lantern room, I was drenched in sweat, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The room was just as I had left it, but now the air felt heavier, charged with an oppressive energy. The central lantern stood cold and lifeless, its massive glass casing smeared with grime and salt. I approached it cautiously, the weight of Arthur's words pressing down on me. The light must reach the heart of the darkness. I murmured to myself, the lantern at the top of the lighthouse had to be that light. I set down my smaller lantern and began working to ignite the large one. The mechanism was old and rusted, but it seemed functional. My hands moved frantically, fueled by adrenaline, as I poured oil into the reservoir and struck a match. The moment the flame caught, the entire room was engulfed in a brilliant, blinding light. The lantern's beam shot out across the sea, piercing through the night like a sword. For a moment, everything was still, and then the screaming began. The shadows surged upward, flooding into the lantern room like a tidal wave of darkness. They writhed and twisted, trying desperately to extinguish the light, but it was too powerful. The beam seemed to burn them, their forms disintegrating into ash as they came into contact with it. The air was filled with the sound of their anguish, a symphony of rage and despair. I shielded my eyes, the light almost too intense to bear, but I couldn't look away. As the last of the shadows dissolved, the oppressive weight in the air lifted. The room grew quiet, save for the faint hum of the lantern's mechanism. I stood there, trembling, as the reality of what had just happened sank in. It was over. I descended the staircase slowly, the lantern's beam illuminating the way. The lighthouse felt different now, less like a prison and more like a sanctuary. When I reached the base, the gate was open once more, and beyond it was the familiar rocky shore. I stepped outside, breathing in the salty sea air, and turned back to look at the lighthouse. Its beam stretched out across the water, a steady, reassuring presence in the night. Arthur's journal was still in my hand, its pages fluttering in the breeze. I didn't know what had drawn Arthur to this place, or why he had left the journal behind for me to find. But I knew one thing for certain. The lighthouse was no longer a haven for darkness. As I walked away, the sound of waves crashing against the rocks filled the silence. The voices, the shadows, the cold, they were gone. But I knew I'd never forget what I'd seen, what I'd endured. Some places, no matter how beautiful, carry scars of their own. And some stories, no matter how terrifying, deserve to be told.